Hey there, students. Professor Zeeb here. Welcome into our video lecture. And this time we're going to talk about something that people don't want to talk about, and that is aging. You know, we live in this society that really values youth, and we spend all this money to make ourselves look younger, for example. So we're going to look in this particular lecture at how we age, or some reasons why we age. Now, I'm going to warn you guys, a lot of the theories are physiological in nature, and they are very technical. So hopefully you've had your morning cup of coffee, because this one, you're gonna need to stimulate your mind a little bit. It's a lot of biology and technical terms coming at you very shortly, but we're going to attempt to explain why we age and thus die eventually, okay? So let's get into our slides here. Okay, so we go into the biological, physiological theories of aging. So we have several of these. You guys can kind of figure out which one you like best. Some of them, you know, have strengths and weaknesses and things like that. So I'll kind of let you make up your mind as we go. All right, so our first theory is really the most obvious why we age. It's called the wear and tear theory. You know, basically, you know, it's just what it sounds like, is that over time our bodies wear out and then it creates problems. Just like if you drove your car every day for years, eventually the parts would wear out and start falling off and things like that. It's kind of what we mean, is that over time, tear is sort of, wear and tear has been placed on our organs and our body systems, and it creates problems. Even though this theory makes complete sense, there's not a lot of research that supports it. The results seem to be a little bit mixed there. But once again, it seems very obvious that that potentially could happen, that over time our organs would wear out or our bodies would wear out. So it seems very obvious. The next theory is called the evolutionary theory. And so what the theorists are saying here is that one of the reasons we age when we do is because it's programmed into us through evolution. Now, I'm sure you guys know what evolution is. Survival of the fittest, adapting traits that help us survive, and we pass those on to our offspring. So the theorists here are basically saying that mammals are one of the few species that lives well past the end of their reproductive period. So when we compare humans to other animals, I guess what we're saying here is that we, you know, as an example, we live well past menopause. Remember we said menopause is around 51 or so, depending on the person. So one of the reasons that we live so long past that particular time, for women in this case, is to allow us to survive, to allow us to do things that would enable the species to survive. In other words, that's programmed into us through the laws of evolution. For example, this gives our older folks a chance to teach the younger generations about how to survive, what you should be doing, what you should not be doing, how to stay healthy and stress-free, for example. So in other words, that's an evolutionary explanation, because it allows the species overall to become better, to be more adaptive to their environment, for example, and then potentially that is passed down the line. So once again, they're saying that we age at a certain time. This doesn't happen until a certain time, because evolution has programmed that into us in a certain way. Okay, so next we go to the homeostatic imbalance theory. I don't know if you guys know what homeostasis is, but let's go ahead and define that. Homeostasis, really the gist of it is that it's maintaining this optimal balance within the body, or an equilibrium. In other words, if we have too much salt in our body's going to take measures to correct that and keep it in check. If we have too much sugar or too less sugar, for example, which our body needs to run, it's going to take corrective measures to balance that out, to get the appropriate level so we maintain our health, to stay healthy. In other words, we have these systems in play that help to regulate and modulate these imbalances. So when things go wrong, our body has certain systems or feedback systems to keep that in check, to keep it in its proper place. So what they're saying here is that over time, these feedback systems related to this become damaged, or they become maladaptive and create problems. So therefore, it allows those imbalances to occur, which leads to organ damage and thus the signs of aging as we know them. So this could be anything from body temperature to salt levels as an example, or water levels. It kind of depends on what we're talking about. But we know things like stress can cause this to happen. So you can kind of see a connection there. So hopefully you understand that one. It's just saying that the systems that keep things in balance become disruptive and create problems down the line. Okay, so next we go to a very technical one, and that is the cross-linkage theory. Okay, so obviously this is going to require some explanation on my part. So cross-links are these bonds that are formed in the body between peptides. So peptides are proteins. And when that happens, it causes an alteration of the body, okay? So when these bonds or these cross-links are formed, it alters what the body basically is. We think that over time, as we get older, the chances of these cross-links occurring go up, and therefore our body becomes altered. So the classic example of this is something called collagen. Collagen is a connective tissue, and it's protein related, obviously. And one of the things it does is it controls the elasticity of our skin. It's involved in that. So once these cross-links form in collagen, it may damage the skin or the skin's ability to snap back when we're young. And thus we would see sagging or folds or wrinkles, for example. In other words, the classic signs of aging. So do you guys understand that one? So in other words, these bonds, cross-links are formed over time, which physically alter what the body is, and thus it leads to damaging effects or the effects of aging. Okay, so next we go to the free radical theory. So what this is basically saying, and this is related to a lot of different problems, is that through our metabolism, every time our metabolism runs, it produces waste products, okay? Just like when you run your car, it burns up fuel and it produces pollution. It produces a waste product. It's kind of the same thing in an analogy, is that as our metabolism runs every day, it creates these waste products which basically build up, okay? So in this particular case, we're saying that it's the byproducts of oxygen, okay, which are known as free radicals. These will ricochet around the cells and actually damage our DNA over time. So it can damage the DNA, it can damage cell structures, for example, and thus lead to things like cancer, arthritis as an example. So the point is that these waste products, in this particular case, the byproducts of oxygen, free radicals, build up and damage our cells and thus lead to aging and problems with the organs and body structures and so forth. So that's really kind of the gist of that one. Okay, next we go to autoimmunity. A lot of you probably heard of this. So this is where the immune system in the body is rejecting our own tissue. In other words, we're attacking ourselves in a sense, and this increases with age, as we've learned, okay? Several different things can happen or cause this to happen. It could be some kind of new antigen that the body does not recognize. It could be, bacteria that's gotten in the body, or maybe other foreign particles that the body doesn't recognize. Some people believe that it may be hidden cells in the body that over time are released, and our body does not recognize those, and it attacks them and creates problems. Other theorists have mentioned that it may be a mutation. So maybe a mutation has occurred, and those are more likely to occur over time, and thus it creates a form of a cell that the body doesn't recognize, and it attacks it as if it's a foreign body. So this leads to things like rheumatoid arthritis, hypertension, for example, diabetes. The point is that if the body is rejecting its own tissue and attacking it as if it's threatening, it's going to damage what the body is and thus lead to organ malfunction or some kind of problem with the body, which thus is linked to aging. So hopefully that makes sense there. All right, next we go to the accumulation of errors theory. So let me kind of explain this. Every time our cells die, our body takes measures to replace those cells. So it's constantly regenerating cells. So for example, every time you get in the shower in the morning and you're scrubbing your skin, those dead cells are coming off, but then our body will replace them. So there's this sort of system in place where a cell is recreated, regenerated, or copies itself, for example. In other words, new proteins make new cells, probably on a daily basis in several quantities. And so what we're saying here is that every time that happens, every time a new cell is created, there's a slight chance that some type of error would occur in that process. So it's very, very small, and yet it is there. There's a slight chance that an error could occur, okay? Now, when we're young, because the numbers at this point are so small, the risk is relatively low, right? Does that make sense? In other words, when you're a young person, even though you've created a lot of cells, it's nothing compared to, say, when you're 50, when you've done that every day for 50 years or whatever it is, right? So in other words, what they're saying is that the sheer odds of an error occurring increase over time and thus make it more likely to happen in old age. And thus when that happens, it creates some type of error and that changes the body. That leads to problems with the organs or signs of aging. So does that make sense? So in other words, by the time you're older, you've generated so many different cells that the odds of an error occurring will go up over time and thus making it more likely to happen. So that explains why we age when we're older, is because the odds are kind of stacked against us. The sheer numbers basically are going up all the time. Okay, so next we go to genetics. So we said that through evolution, that aging may be programmed into us at a certain time. So obviously this is related to that. But a lot of researchers believe that we may possess these harmful genes that are expressed once we get older. So we have some evidence that aging is linked to genetics. Some of our best evidence for that comes from identical twin research. We know that monozygotic twins have similar lengths of life compared to dizygotic twins. Remember, we said those are identical and fraternal twins. So if identical twins are living at about the same length compared to fraternal twins, that leads us to believe that it's genetically determined because they share more genetics, as we said, in some cases 100%. So we think that there's some kind of genetic factor where you inherit some type of tendency to live a length, and that may be sort of genetically, biologically determined. Next, we go to what's called the cellular clock theory. So it turns out that cells actually divide less as we age. So as we get into the older ages, those numbers will go down and thus leading to problems, okay? But however, let me get a little bit more specific here. Something we're going to focus on is something called a telomere, also known as junk DNA, okay? So telomeres are these pieces of DNA that are at the end of chromosomes. If you guys remember from early on in the class, we said that chromosomes are long strands of DNA that contain thousands and thousands of genes, okay? So if you looked at the very end of that sequence, there's these sections called telomeres, almost like the tail of the chromosome or the DNA strand, in a sense, okay? And we think that these strands of DNA, these telomeres, protect our cells during division. So if you're more of a visual person, it kind of looks like this. So it'd be these sections here at the tips of the chromosomes, okay? And we think that when cells divide, which they're doing all the time through mitosis, as we said before, these sections of the chromosomes of the DNA help to protect cells during that process, okay? The problem is, however, that anytime a cell copies itself, it cannot copy the complete sequence of DNA. In other words, these tips may not be completely copied over to the next cell. So thus, theoretically, they become smaller and smaller through multiple divisions. In other words, it's almost like a little piece is snipped off each time they divide, or somewhere around there. And thus the DNA sequence has now been altered and thus our cell's ability to protect itself during division becomes somewhat compromised, okay? So the point is that that DNA sequence is now incomplete theoretically, which opens the door for problems to happen as we get older, because down the road, these sections have now become smaller and smaller, okay? So we have found, so once again, to kind of link it to the class and link into, a lot of the themes that we've been talking about all semester, our health and our activity seem to be correlated with longer telomeres. So what that basically means, people that have really good health and people who are physically active, for example, have longer telomeres, which basically means they will probably live longer. The effects of aging will not hit them in the same way because for some reason the telomeres are being preserved, or they're longer, or less is basically snipped off. Whatever the reason is, the telomeres seem to be involved to longevity. And so once again, the theme of the class is that if you're a healthy person, you eat correctly, you don't smoke and drink, you're getting enough sleep, you're active and you exercise, all of those things seem to help the telomere length, and that translates into different aging factors. Okay, so next we go to the mitochondrial theory. I don't know if you guys remember your cell biology, but mitochondria are basically the powerhouses of the cell. So it's like a little organelle inside a cell. These give energy to the cell for growth, repair, and function. So in other words, they're important to maintaining the cell and keeping it going. We have found through research that these become damaged due to oxidative problems, okay? More specifically, the sirtuins seem to be related to this problem. So a sirtuin are these proteins that help to regulate the mitochondria. Okay, let me say that again. So sirtuins are proteins that help to regulate mitochondria. In other words, they sort of preserve our mitochondria, which are important to a cell's function, okay? So if these become compromised, it's linked to problems with the DNA, because what they do is they help to preserve DNA, they repair it through aging. And so if these become problematic, they damage the mitochondria through oxidative type issues, and that can lead to problems. So for example, it's been linked to cancer, it's been linked to arthritis, a classic aging symptom or problem of aging. They've even connected it to Alzheimer's, which happens obviously in later years. So once again, these proteins that help to kind of regulate the mitochondria may become compromised and thus damage the mitochondria. All right, finally, we go to the hormonal stress theory. We've been talking about in the semester that stress is absolutely horrible for us, especially if you don't find ways to combat it and regulate that. So anytime we're stressed, especially when we're really stressed out, hormones are produced, more specifically the stress hormone known as cortisol. And we have found that these lower our immune system. So we've talked about that, which opens the door for disease to actually happen. So as we age, to kind of put in perspective in aging and so forth, as we get older, these hormones remain at elevated levels for a longer period of time and thus create a higher risk for health-related problems and thus aging. So for example, it could put us at risk for hypertension, high blood pressure, cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. So if you guys remember when we talked about the general adaptation syndrome, how as we get older, our body's ability to fight off stress is shown, and this is kind of obviously related to that. So these stress levels or these hormone levels are elevated at longer periods of time as we become older, and thus are more likely to create problems in older age compared to when we're 20 or when we're younger or whatever. All right. So like I said, a lot of these are technical. Hopefully you understand them. You can always email me if you have questions about those. Make sure you know each one there for the exam and so forth. And hopefully this has enlightened you in terms of why we age and some different factors, even though they're very technical in nature. All right, So this will conclude our short lecture here. Please move on to the next step in the class.